Welcome back to Giant Monster Games! My name is Adrian, and today we are looking at Eldrazi and Taxes. Not long ago, I took this deck out to GP Toronto and actually played in the Modern main event with it. I didn't do very well because I didn't have much practice with the deck, but the deck actually is very strong and I won a whole bunch of events once I started playing side events with the deck and actually getting some practice in. So let's actually break the deck down, but before I do that, don't forget to go over to Flipside Gaming if you want to pick this deck up in paper or any other deck on the channel. Use promo code GiantMonsterGames to get 10% off your online purchase. And if you want to pick this deck up for MTGO, there's a link to Card Hoarder where you can pick the deck up quick and fast, and it supports the channel when you do it. Okay, let's get into it, starting out with, what is Eldrazi and Taxes? Well, it is a subset of the Hate Bears or Death and Taxes deck, except we're using a bunch of Eldrazi cards that make the deck work really efficiently. With that, the cards you have in almost every Death and Taxes / Hate Bears deck, you have Aven Mindcensor, Leonin Arbiter, and Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. We have these cards because they all prevent our opponent from efficiently doing whatever they want to do. Obviously, Leonin Arbiter and Aven Mindcensor preventing your opponent from searching effectively, and Thalia is making non-creature spells cost a little bit more, which makes a lot of decks having to pay 2 to do a removal spell really slows them down. Our next two cards, Thought-Knot Seer and Tidehollow Sculler, are actually where we start diverging away from the Death and Taxes decks, because these are both giving us hand disruption, which is actually a key part of the Eldrazi and Taxes deck, where we're trying to disrupt our opponent's hand, along with making everything else they do a little bit more difficult. Also, I want to point this out, Thought-Knot Seer is probably our best beater in the deck, so he is probably going to be doing most of the damage once you get him into play, so keep this in mind. So these guys giving us hand disruption, which is really good. And then our last two creatures are Eldrazi Displacer and flickerwisp. Now, these two cards is what makes Eldrazi and Taxes an insane combo. Flickerwisp, as you've probably seen in almost every single Hate Bear / Death and Taxes deck, because it allows you to come in, it plays in, and then it actually bounces stuff. So there's all kinds of crazy shenanigans you can do with flickerwisp. But once we put in Eldrazi Displacer, we can actually flicker flickerwisp at any time we want, assuming we have the mana to pay for it. So there are a lot of really good combos we can actually do with flickerwisp and Eldrazi Displacer. I will actually do an entire list of all the things you can do with this at the end of the video so you can actually see the kind of crazy interactions that this deck is capable of, and one of the reasons why this deck is actually a little bit hard to pilot and take some practice. Next, we're going to move over to a section I'm calling Utility Cards. We have Aether Vial, Wasteland Strangler, and Smuggler's Copter. Aether Vial, which you'll see in every single Eldrazi and Taxes deck, every single Hate Bears deck, every single Death and Taxes deck. It is allowing us to cheat creatures in at instant speed, making Flickerwisp extremely powerful, making Leonin Arbiter even more powerful, and we also can flash in chump blockers and do all kinds of fun stuff. Wasteland Strangler may look a little strange in the deck, but there is some very good synergies with it. It is basically a creature with creature removal that is quite effective, and also has some synergies with what we do. So we have 4 ways of getting rid of cards technically in the deck. So we have Path to Exile, Thought-Knot Seer, Tidehollow Sculler, and Flickerwisp. So Flickerwisp and Tidehollow Sculler, on the other hand, are temporary. Flickerwisp is until end of turn, and Tidehollow Sculler is until Tidehollow Sculler leaves play. So if we have either of those two cards from Flickerwisp or Tidehollow Sculler exiled, then we play a Wasteland Strangler. We get to put that card from exile temporary into our opponent's graveyard, which means it can't come back even if Tidehollow Sculler or Flickerwisp's trigger brings that card back. The card is gone forever, so this is the extra synergy we're going to be getting from it, so you can use it to remove a card from your opponent's hand and then keep it removed for a long time, which is absolutely fantastic. So this is why Wasteland Strangler is in here. Also, he is on a body as well, so if you do need a blocker, do need a chump blocker, you can always play him without the benefit, but 99% of the time you're kind of going to hold on to him and play him at the perfect time to make things go away forever / kill a creature. So it is pretty cool. And then Smuggler's Copter is allowing us to do 2 things. One, it is going to get damage in the air, because there is often going to be times where there are bigger threats we just can't swing through. I'm looking at Death Shadow, I'm looking at Tarmogoyfs, where we're just not able to push through it, so get damage in the air can help out. Also, it allows us to filter our hand, because as soon as we start getting to the drawing the top card of our deck and hopefully we get something we need, we tend to get into a really big problem. That is a big problem for us, so Smuggler's Copter is going to hopefully prevent us from getting there by allowing us to actually get the cards we need to lock our opponent down. Because if we can get a Flickerwisp and an Eldrazi Displacer and a bunch of mana to actually do them, we are going to be able to do some amazing stuff, but if we don't have those, we need to be able to actually get them again, or get some other combination of stuff which will allow us to pin our opponent down and make them lose or not be able to do what they need to do. So Smuggler's Copter is allowing us to get there and do that. The next section we have is called Value Removal, which if you've seen the Budget Death and Taxes deck, you have seen this combo before. Basically, it is Leonin Arbiter in combination with Path to Exile or Ghost Quarter. So both Path to Exile and Ghost Quarter, when you play them, allow your opponent to search up a basic land and put it into play. So if they don't have the mana to pay for Leonin Arbiter's ability, then they don't get to do that, which is, for me, really, really funny, because you basically get to exile a creature for 1 mana, which is amazing. That's like the best removal spell in Magic the Gathering. And or you can actually Ghost Quarter, which is a wasteland. Basically, you sacrifice your land, they sacrifice their land, or well, you remove their land. They don't get to sacrifice. You get to destroy it for them. So Ghost Quarter being extremely powerful, especially if they can't go and fetch up a basic land. This combination will come in handy all the time, and you will find a lot of really good ways to use it. Now, one thing I learned about playing this deck for a while is Leonin Arbiter with one of these cards is a really good turn 3 play. Leonin Arbiter is a bit of a lightning rod, so as soon as you play him, he tends to be removed really quickly because people want to search the libraries. Turns out, who would have guessed? So you can play him on turn 3, assuming you have your Ghost Quarter and it's untapped, and or you have white mana untapped. You can then play Leonin Arbiter and then remove one of their things in response to them trying to remove Leonin Arbiter. It is the best way of doing it. Otherwise, you kind of lose value. If you play him on turn 2 and then he gets removed before it goes back to your turn, you lose all the value of Leonin Arbiter. So that is one of the big things you need to remember when playing this guy. Next, we're going to move over to the land package. I actually have a very efficient land package, which for me is very nice. Normally, most of the budget decks are quite budget. So first thing, we have ways of producing colorless mana. We have Caverns of Kolos, Eldrazi Temple, and Ghost Quarter. Caverns of Kolos also providing black and white mana if we need it. Obviously, we're going to pay life if we need those mana, so it's not the best, but it is really good at creating colorless mana, which is why we actually have it in the deck. Eldrazi Temple allowing us to get one of our Eldrazi's into play a turn early because it creates 2 colorless mana for Eldrazi spells only, so we can be playing Eldrazi Displacer on turn 2, or we can be playing Thought-Knot Seer on turn 3, which in a lot of cases is really good. A 4/4 that removes a card from your opponent's hand on turn 3, amazing. And then Ghost Quarter, you know what Ghost Quarter does. The next cards we have is Concealed Courtyard, Godless Shrine, and Shambling Vents. All of these are just good mana fixing. Concealed Courtyard comes into play untapped if we play it early. Late game, we're not too concerned about it. Godless Shrine, again, we only run a couple of them because we don't necessarily want to be paying a whole bunch of life, because if we start burning up a bunch of our life, then it allows our opponent to get to us faster, because our opponent will likely get a little bit of damage in, and us burning ourselves a whole bunch before, not really something we want to do. And then Shambling Vents is giving us a backup plan if we do need to gain some life and or need to swing in for a little extra damage. It is a really good beater when we need them, especially once we get to the mid to late game. And then lastly, we have Plains and Swamps, just in case we get Blood Mooned or we get Ghost Quartered or Path to Exiled ourselves. We actually have stuff to fetch up. I think if I was to redo this deck, I would probably also put in a Waste, which is a type of basic land, so we actually could activate most of our Eldrazi spells, because right now, if we get Blood Mooned, all of our Eldrazi's are completely unplayable. So that's something I would think of if I was to redo this deck. That is the entire deck, but let's talk about the sideboard and what I took out specifically to tech against decks I thought I would see at GP Toronto. First of all, I have Aven Mindcensor, Disenchant, and Stony Silence. These are helping us deal with Affinity and any deck that is going to be running Ensnaring Bridge, because Ensnaring Bridge is a really big problem for us. We can actually technically Flickerwisp it away, but it takes a lot of extra work. So having a couple Disenchants in the sideboard allows us to just remove them, or remove Steel Overseers, or remove Ravengers. So this is what this is doing in the sideboard. Also, technically, Stony Silence helps us slow down Tron if we need to. Not all Tron builds are actually using artifacts, but if they are, we can Stony Silence them to help slow them down. And then Aven Mindcensor, just preventing people from searching their libraries as much, because there's a few times where we want to slow people down from searching even more. Next, we have Leyline of Sanctity and Rest in Peace. Now, Rest in Peace is really good against any Graveyard Synergy deck. Not necessarily Dredge, because it is good against Dredge, but we don't really have a problem with Dredge. It is really good against Traverse Shadow Jund, Izzet Pyromancer, and Mardu Pyromancer, and Hollow One. We really, in theory, need to get a Rest in Peace into play on turn 2 if we are going to beat those decks, because we don't have the speed that they do. They are extremely fast decks, and we rely on getting to, like, turn 6 before we start getting the win, because our opponent's been slowed down, and now we kind of have a little bit of a control lock on, so we really need to get Rest in Peace. I actually think if I was to redo this deck, I would probably put Rest in Peace up to 3, potentially even 4 Rest in Pieces in the sideboard, because they become that important against those decks, and those decks are quite heavily in the meta right now, and I suspect they're going to get even worse. The next thing is Leyline of Sanctity. Leyline of Sanctity because this deck really loses once you start getting hand disruption. So if your opponent is going to be doing stuff like thought seizing you or inquisitioning you, you're going to have a really hard time. As soon as you lose a Flickerwisp or as soon as you lose an Aether Vial, it becomes really, really difficult for you to start getting the advantage. So Leyline of Sanctity helps us prevent our opponent from getting the advantage by removing cards out of our hand. It also stops stuff like Liliana, which is going to make us sacrifice our creatures as well. So things that we need to keep in mind. Leyline of Sanctity, super important. I almost think 4 Leyline of Sanctity might be good in the sideboard as well. I was running 3 because I needed a bunch of other extra stuff. And then lastly, we have Brenton, Forge Tender, Ghostly Prison, and Selfless Spirit. Selfless Spirit you generally see in the main board, but I was trying to run in the sideboard as a way of like preventing all of our creatures from dying. I actually think it was the weakest card in my sideboard, and I would probably remove it for some other better tech cards. Ghostly Prison really was against fast aggro decks, so I'm thinking about stuff like Humans, or a bunch of the Mardu Pyromancer deck, where they're trying to get a whole bunch of tokens, and they're swinging in for like 2 or 3 damage every single turn with a bunch of elementals. So that is what Ghostly Prison was really aiming to do. And then Burton Forge Tender, because we do have a little bit of problem with burn, so it is going to give us the advantage and the edge, where we're not going to have to worry too much about them swinging in, because we can just chump block their Goblin Guides or other red creatures. Also, Brenton Forge Tender is also one of our only cards that actually allows us to go up against Mardu Pyromancer and some of the red decks where we just need a chump blocker for their big red stuff or their onslaught of red stuff. Also, another extremely important thing about Brenton Forge Tender is sacrifice it to prevent all damage from a red source of your choice. So we can use this against a Anger of the Gods to prevent Anger of the Gods from doing any damage to anything. It's not just damage to us or to a source, it is from that source entirely. So we can prevent our board from being wiped if we are going to be seeing a Anger of the Gods come down. And that is the entire deck, but I want to talk about some of the amazing lines of play that you really need to practice the deck to be able to see these things actually working, and why I don't think I did very good in the main event. So to start out with, we have Leonin Arbiter. Let's talk about some of the cool things you can do with Leonin Arbiter. Obviously, I've talked about the Leonin Arbiter, Path to Exile, and Ghost Quarter combo, which is really cool. Again, play Leonin Arbiter, Path to Exile, Ghost Quarter makes it so our opponent can't search their library if they don't have the mana to pay for it, which then gets us value because they lose their creature or lose their land without actually getting a replacement, which is fantastic. But there is another really good combination, and that is Aether Vial with 2 counters on it. Aether Vial becomes a really good combo in a lot of cases, so we have Aether Vial with 2 counters on it. Now, our opponent decides they want to, say, crack a Bloodstained Mire, and we, in response to them cracking it, so well that trigger is on the stack, we play a Leonin Arbiter with Aether Vial, making it so our opponent can no longer search their library unless they pay 2 mana. So our opponent might have thought, oh yeah, I'm safe, there's no Leonin Arbiter, I don't have anything to pay, this is going to be the good way to go. Not necessarily. We can actually trick them and make it so they are no longer going to search, even though they just cracked their land, which they may not have done until they removed Leonin Arbiter. But the next one is we're going to talk about Flickerwisp. Flickerwisp is the biggest, most important creature in this deck, and actually, if I go back and redo a revisited version of the budget Death and Taxes, 4 of Flickerwisp is going to be a must-have in that deck, because after playing this deck for a while, you realize how amazing Flickerwisp is. Flickerwisp is like the card. If your opponent is going to remove a card out of your hand, it should be Flickerwisp. I don't care what else they take, Flickerwisp is the most important card in this deck. So here's a list of things you can do with Flickerwisp if you cast it from your hand. So this is literally just playing it straight out from your hand. The first thing Flickerwisp can do is it can remove a blocker. So if you want to attack, say you have a bunch of creatures you want to attack in, and your opponent has a Death Shadow that is maybe, let's say, Death Shadow on 10. So your opponent is at 3, you just need to get a little through damage, and he has a giant Death Shadow that you're not going to be able to get through. So play a Flickerwisp on your first main phase, targeting that creature goes away until the end step, and then you no longer have to worry about him as being a blocker. The second thing we can do is remove tokens permanently. So your opponent is playing Mardu Pyromancer, they have a young Pyromancer in play and are creating a whole bunch of little 1/1 elemental creature tokens. You can't deal with them, you need to get rid of them. Play Flickerwisp, targeting one of the tokens. The token leaves play, and then because it is not an actual card, technically, it can't come back and it doesn't return. It doesn't return, it goes away and it stays away forever. Number 3, we can remove counters off of anything that gets counters. So Aether Vials, Engineer Explosive, Chalice of the Void, Arcbound Ravager, there's a whole bunch. There's a lot of things that see play that get counters on them in some variety. When we cast Flickerwisp, it targets any permanent, so we can just target one of these things. That card gets exiled, and when it returns to play, because it is a new instance of that card, it doesn't remember it has any counters on it. Next, we can use it to untap our lands. So let's say we have 3 planes. We play a Flickerwisp, which takes us to tap all of our land. comes into play, we target one of our lands at our end step, it'll come back because it comes back from exile, returning to play, and lands come into play untapped. Number 5, untap one of your creatures after combat. So let's say you swing in with creature, second main phase, you then play flickerwisp, that creature gets exiled, your creature that you just attacked with. At your end step, it comes back, and because creatures also enter the battlefield untapped, it comes into play untapped, which, again, you now have a blocker. Number 6, you can reset planeswalkers. If you're getting to the point where your opponent is about to ultimate a planeswalker, or they've been plussing a planeswalker a bunch, bam, get rid of that planeswalker, they exile, they come back, and then they get reset to the number of tokens they have. Pretty simple stuff. It falls in line with number 3. And then number 7, targeting another flickerwisp, so when it comes back, it gets to remove something at the end step. So what does this actually mean? Well, let's say you have a flickerwisp in play. You play a second flickerwisp, targeting the flickerwisp you have in play. So that flickerwisp gets removed until end of turn. That is the big thing about flickerwisp. Things are removed until end of turn. So at end of turn, your second flickerwisp comes back into play, which means it gets to trigger itself. It gets to now target whatever it wants. So when it targets something, it is going to remove that thing until end of the next turn. Which means if you are doing this on your turn, obviously, which you have to be, you get to exile something of your opponent's until the end of their turn. So those are all the things you can do with Flickerwisp if you're casting it from your hand. But once you start throwing in Aether Vial or Eldrazi Displacer, you can start doing Flickerwisp stuff at any time, in response and at instant speed, which is amazing. So here's a list of all the things we can do with that. So number 1, any of the tricks that we've just talked about, you can do at instant speed. You can do them whenever. Number 2 is you can activate it after your opponent declares attackers to remove an attacker. So your opponent says, I'm going to swing in with my giant Eldrazi creature. You can then Aether Vial or flicker a Flickerwisp in play with Eldrazi Displacer, bouncing whatever your opponent just attacked with, removing it from the game entirely, which is very fun. And then at the end step, it obviously comes back. Number 3, you can activate it in response to their removal spells to save a creature. So, something you will see quite often is your opponent saying, well, I can't deal with Eldrazi Displacer or Flickerwisp or other stuff like this, so you Flickerwisp in a Flickerwisp, or you Eldrazi Displacer flicker your Flickerwisp, targeting whatever they were trying to remove. It then gets exiled until the turn, so you don't get it for the rest of the turn, but they don't get to remove it at the same time. You get to keep it because it's going to come back at end of turn. Number 4, you can activate it to save a chump blocker. Your opponent's swinging in with something big that you need to block. You block it, Flickerwisp in, saving that creature because it gets exiled until end of turn and then comes back and is saved by the angel that is Flickerwisp. Number 5, you can activate it at your end step to remove a permanent for the whole turn. So, if you're doing this at end step on your turn, it is going to remove the thing, whatever it is, until your opponent's next end step. If you do it on your opponent's end step, it removes it for your entire turn. I often use this when I'm playing against Lantern Control to remove their ensnaring bridges on my turn, so at their end step I will either flicker my Flickerwisp or bring it in through Aether Vial, targeting their ensnaring bridge, so then I can attack with my creatures and not have to deal with ensnaring bridge, which is a huge problem for us and most decks that are aggro against Lantern Control. And then the last thing, and this is probably the most complicated part of the whole thing, is we can activate it to do a double flicker with Tidehollow Sculler. So what does this actually mean? Well, cards like Tidehollow Sculler, Oblivion Ring, Journey to Nowhere, and a bunch of other cards have their text box separated. As you can see, the enter the battlefield, removing a card from your opponent's hand, or removing a card in the case of Oblivion Ring, is separate compared to its when it leaves play, that card gets returned to your opponent or returned to play. So, if we play our Tidehollow Sculler, the trigger goes on the stack to remove a card from your opponent's hand. In response to that trigger being on the stack, we can either flicker or Aether Vial in a Flickerwisp, targeting our Tidehollow Sculler, which means it now leaves play. When it leaves play, it puts the trigger that it returns that card to your opponent's hand onto the stack as well. So what ends up happening is the trigger where you get that card back, where you're giving that card back to your opponent, resolves first, and then the second trigger, which is take a card from your opponent's hand, which is on Tidehollow Sculler, then triggers, meaning that card has already technically been returned to your opponent before you ever took it, which means that card actually just gets exiled. It doesn't actually have an ability to go back to your opponent's hand. And then, fun thing as well, when it comes back at end of turn, you actually get to Tidehollow Sculler again. So you can double flick your stuff. And those are all of the interactions that I can think of off the top of my head that are really powerful about the Eldrazi and Taxes deck. I hope that this deck sounds interesting to you guys, because it is really fun to play, but it is also really difficult. When I've ever talked about you need to play a deck a bunch to get good at it. You're not just going to take a deck that is like a tier 1 top 8 deck, take it out, and you're going to win games. Not necessarily. The more you play a deck, the better you get. And this was actually the reason why I don't think I did very well at GP Toronto, in the main event that is, because I didn't have enough practice with this deck. If I had 2 or 3 or 4 weeks where I've been playing this deck more and more and more, I would know my matchups better, I would know my lines of play better, knowing, oh, I should do this trick, oh, I should do this trick, because I definitely missed the trick a few times. I missed what I should have been doing a number of times. So this is the big thing with this deck, along with any other deck on the channel, any other deck, period. The more you play it, the better you will get with it. So this is a perfect example where I didn't have enough practice, and I didn't do very well. I am going to say there's not going to be any gameplay on MTGO with this deck because I don't own most of these cards, so I'm not going to go and buy some of the expensive cards to do some gameplay when I own this entire deck in paper, and I'm going to go play it at my FNM rather than playing it on MTGO. My name is Adrian, this is GiantMonsterGames. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to game like a giant monster. I would like to throw a huge shout out to all of the Patreon supporters. You guys are helping make videos just like this possible. If you want to join them and be also a Patreon, there is a link on screen. Click the Patreon logo or in the description below this video.